China, the rise of China, I would argue, is the most important event in the world since the British Industrial Revolution. And it's going to change the world very profoundly. And it's going to change the world very profoundly in two ways, not one. It's going to change it economically, and I think we can already see this. And secondly, it's going to change it politically, intellectually, morally, spiritually, ethically, militarily, culturally. It's going to change the world in a profounder way, if not more profound way, than the rise of the West has over the last 200 years. Now, first of all, I want to talk about the economic side of it, because that's obviously very fundamental. The rise started in 1978, when China started to grow at about 10% a year. But when it started to grow at 10% a year, it was only 1/20th of the size of the American economy. So the impact of China, even growing at 10% a year on the world, was extremely small. But now China is over half the size of the American economy. And it's still growing very fast, between 7.5% and 8% a year. And it will likely continue to do so. This is the background. Now, there are, I know, it's fashionable, well, actually, I think that sort of the general mentality in the West towards China is what I would describe as a bearish sentiment. In other words, people are always expecting Chinese growth to, at some point, decline and, broadly speaking, as we've known it, end. That has been a constant refrain. And even now, you will have noticed since the financial crisis, a lot of the attention to China is, is it slowing down? Is it going to hit an economic crisis, and so on? Well, of course, China's got big economic problems, huge economic problems compared with what we've got. But the extraordinary thing about China is that since 1978, and it's difficult to know exactly why, but basically it's not had an economic crisis. It's carried on growing at 10% a year for over 30 years. Now, I want to emphasize that the impact of the Western financial crisis on the rise of China, or the relative position of China, to put it more precisely, has been to accelerate China's relative rise. This finishes a bit early. No, I should bring it up to date, but it's 2011, and it over on the left-hand side is the marked 100 is the size of the GDP of most range of Western countries in 2008, and you'll see by early 2011, most of them were still smaller than they were then, and Britain is still smaller than they were then. Now, and America is now a bit bigger, but not much bigger. Now we superimpose China over that period. And you can see China's been growing very rapidly in that period. The economy by 2011 was 1/3 larger than it was in 2008. Now, the effect of this process has been to accelerate China's relative rise compared with the situation in the West. And I don't think really, with all the sort of noise of the media, this is clear in people's minds, that this process has continued and accelerated. And one of the effects of this process is this. In the Goldman Sachs projections, which are widely quoted, I use it in my book, in 2007 it was projected that the Chinese economy would overtake the size of the American economy in terms of GDP by exchange rates in 2027. That was made in 2007. Now, the key figure here, the key thing to look at is GDP at market rates. This was put together by the economists, and it's a sort of consensus of what's happening. And you'll see all the red lines are where China's already overtaken the United States, And the blue lines are where it's still due to when it's likely to overtake the United States. And the purple line is GDP, and the projection now is that China will overtake the United States in terms of GDP by exchange rates, not in 2027, but in 2018, which is, in historical terms, just round the corner. We're very close to that situation now. And I would argue that actually what's happening now is that China is probably a more important shaper of the global economy, a more important shaper of globalization than the United States. And there are three footprints of China, economic footprints of China, I want to illustrate this point with. The first is, China is a huge trader. It's the second, almost now the biggest, but still the second biggest importer in the world, mainly for commodities. And you have all these commodities for which China's consumption is a very high proportion of global consumption. It is also a huge exporter. Overtook 2 or 3 years ago the United States, which had held the position for 110 years, as the largest producer of manufacturing goods in the world, and China is the biggest exporter in the world. And I just think these figures are so interesting. This is China as a trading partner of the combination of exports and imports of these various countries. Okay, and I've just summarised it. There's a great long list of them. But 1992. For Argentina, China accounted for 1.1% of the trade, of Argentina's trade. And then you'll see a dramatic change in Argentina's case. But what is fascinating is if you go back to 1992, apart from a number of East Asian countries, there were barely any countries in the world for which China was the biggest trading partner. Hardly any. And now, now here being 2010, there are many countries for which China is the biggest trading partner. I mean, I don't know whether I've got a light here, have I? Yeah. I mean, Brazil, for decades, America was the largest trading partner. China's overtaken it. It's now 14%. America is around 10%. Obviously, Chile is China is its biggest trading partner. Venezuela. The United States it's either China or it's Canada. They're very close together. I'm not sure it's the largest trading partner for Russia, but I think it is now. And then for Pakistan, largest trading partner, India's largest trading partner, China. Egypt, not sure. Saudi Arabia, not sure. South Africa, China's the largest trading partner. All these East Asian countries and Australia. And this is steadily growing. I mean, this is a fantastic transformation in 20 years, and it's growing. I don't think it'll carry on growing as rapidly as it has, because China's exports are not going to carry on growing as rapidly as they have because of the shift towards consumption. But nonetheless, the process will continue. Or take another measurement of China's rise, which is finance. I mean, in 2009 and 2010, between them, the China Development Bank and the China Export-Import Bank were responsible for more lending to the developing world than the World Bank. The World Bank, one of the two great institutions of the post-war American world order. And one can see that in time, the World Bank is going to become relatively insignificant, probably, in global terms. It depends a lot on to what extent countries like China and to a lesser extent India and so on put their funds, their money into the World Bank. But I suspect that it'll be much more complicated than that, because I expect there to be a different kind of international economic order as China develops along with other developing countries. But China is the key player, without any doubt, in this respect. Or a third area, which I'm not going to illustrate, but is the rise of the renminbi. I mean, the renminbi, very wisely, against all advice from the West, against the Washington Consensus, the Chinese did not make their currency convertible. Why? Because they wanted to be able to control the development of the Chinese economy free from speculative movements which could derail or destabilize the economy. They never did it. Even now, it is not a convertible currency. Very wise. I assure you the Chinese policymakers are very smart. Very, very smart. And they made a very good strategic decision. But since 2008 autumn, they started to begin to make the renminbi available in the settlement of trade. In other words, paying for their exports and imports. So now it's responsible for quite a slice of its trade, quite a slice of the trade with Africa by China is done in the renminbi. And this is true for Latin America and so on. The renminbi is beginning to become an international currency. In time, down the road, it will become convertible. And when it comes convertible, I think it won't be very long before it displaces the dollar as the dominant reserve currency in the world. I'm not going to fix a time on it, but we're not talking about 50 years. We're talking about, well, it depends when they make it convertible, but within the next 20 years. Within the next 20 years. Maybe much less. I mean, it could be much less, but in my view, the Chinese, I think, should tread cautiously in this respect. I think they've got other problems, other fish to fry before they start becoming a reserve currency with all that involves. Now, let's raise our sights a little bit more, okay? Let's push the boat out in time terms, the horizon a bit further, and look at these figures that have been compiled by Huang Gong, who's at Tsinghua University, very good economist, very good economic statistician as well. And these figures are not so different from others that have been put together. But can I draw your attention here to China in 1820 accounted for 1/3 of global GDP. And then it had a horrific decline, what the Chinese call the century of humiliation. You see, and it hits bottom around the time of the 1949 revolution, 4.6% of global GDP, catastrophic decline. In fact, for over a century, Chinese GDP more or less froze, like India's actually, and then began to grow with independence, or in China's case, with its revolution. In India's case, with its independence, and then it starts going. Now, Huang Gong's done these estimates for 2020 and 2030. These figures, by the way, are GDP according to PPP, primary product. So, purchasing power, primary purchasing power. Sorry, and look at 2030. And Huang Gong's estimate is that by 2030, China will account for 33% of global GDP. The future is back to the past, if you like, 33.4%. But what's equally fascinating here is America, 15.1%. In fact, its maximum achievement was 27.3. Well, actually, it was higher than that in the Second World War, because so many European countries were relatively knocked out. But 15.1%, Europe 13.1%. You'll note this. China's economy in 2030, which is only 18 years or whatever it is down the road, 17 years down the road, will be twice the size of the American economy and over twice the size of the European economy. So, to proceed, I'll come back to that in a moment. This is what the global economy could look like in 2030. Japan just 3%, Russia 3%, Brazil 5%, countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam and so on 6%, EU 13%, America 15%, India, which I haven't talked about, 19%, and China 34%. And if I paint the picture like this for you, the top one is GDP at current exchange rates, the bottom one is GDP at PPP, and the red ball is China, and the grey silver ball is the United States. And you'll see this extraordinary historical transformation. I mean, we're talking about only 30 years between the red ball being very, very small, almost like, not like the moon around the Earth, to becoming not yet the sun, but I mean much bigger than the American economy. And Danny Quah at the London School of Economics has put this interesting, done some very interesting work on trying to locate the epicenter of the global economy and how it's shifting. And in 1980, he had it, you know, in the Eastern Atlantic here, and then it steadily shifted. And at the moment, he suggests it's just here. And by 2050, he suggests it'll be on the Indian-Chinese border. This is an extraordinary historic shift that's taking place. You know, this was when the world was still dominated by the North Atlantic, in a sense, and this is how it is changing. And it's changing in another sense as well, just to go back to this. And that's this. Look, what characterizes this era is not just the rise of China. It's also characterized by the transformation in the position of the developing world. If you go back to the 1970s, the mid-1970s, the developed world accounted for 2/3 of global GDP, the developing world only 1/3. Bear in mind that 85% of the world's population lives in the developing world, and only 15% lives, roughly speaking, lives in the developed world. By 2000, it was roughly 50-50. Huang Gong's projection is that the developing world will account for 2/3 of global GDP by 2030. So the great transformation we're talking about, in which China is the leader, but is also the exemplar and is part of the wider phenomenon of the rise of the developing world and the decline of the developed world. That is the era that we live in. And the world is being and will be reconstituted by this process. In my view, we will see the existing international institutions either transformed or replaced, or both, is what I suspect will happen, is both. Because the new rising powers will want to constitute the world over time in a different kind of way. So, that brings me to the end of my economic peroration. Because I want to move on and talk about China. What is China? You know, the economic stuff sort of enables us to think that China is very familiar to us and we know what it is and it's going to be like us. I mean, it doesn't, of course, we've got it wrong so many times. But there's a sort of ease of translation, or we think there's an ease of translation. Now, what about China as a country, as a history, as a nation? How to understand that? Now, the West has always thought, or has long thought, that there is only one modernity. And that modernity is a Western modernity. And that as countries modernize, they Westernize. They become more and more like us. We're all on the upper escalator. We're just on different steps on that escalator. So as China modernizes, it will become just like us. This is an illusion. This is profoundly wrong. This is based on the assumption somehow the process of modernization is simply a function of competition, markets and technology. It is not. It is also a function of history and culture. China has never been Western. It is not Western now, and it never will be Western. I don't mean that it's not learning like crazy from us. I don't mean that it's not incorporated significant parts of that learning into what China is. But the end product will not be a Western-style country. It will be something different. Now, this is where we're all at sea, because we don't think like this. We think that Western concepts, Western ideas, drawn from our own history, drawn from our experience, can explain what China is. I'm sorry, it only has a limited capacity to do that. And I refer here not just to general, media stuff and so on. I refer to a lot of China scholarship by, China experts in the West. I mean, in varying degrees, but there are great exceptions like Lu Xianpai, who I think was a great scholar of China, who was at MIT. Now, what I want to do, the main thing I want to do today, before I get onto the UK and where we're going to be, is to try and give you some building blocks for understanding China. And I'm going to give you, as quickly as I can, 5 key building blocks for understanding China. The first is this. China is a nation state. But it's only called itself a nation state for the last century, bit more than a century. Anyone who knows anything about China knows that it is a lot older than a century. Over 2,000 years ago, with the victory of the Qin dynasty at the end of the warring state periods, you began to get the unification of China. And these are very crude maps, but this is roughly what the Qin dynasty looked like against the borders of modern China. The southern line of the red line is modern China. And if you go back, if you go on to the next dynasty, which lasted a lot longer, the Han dynasty, which is we're still talking about over 2,000 years ago. And there are the borders of the Han dynasty. So China has existed within, roughly, broadly speaking, its present borders. I mean, these parts of China were added much later under the Qing dynasty in the 17th century. The vast majority of Chinese live in this area then and now. Now, the fascinating thing here is this. China, the Chinese, the way the Chinese think of themselves, what it means to be Chinese, the way they think of what China is not a function of the last 100 years of being a nation state. It is a function of more than 2,000 years of being a civilization, or what I call a civilization state. China is primarily not a nation state. It is primarily a civilization state, and only secondarily a nation state. What am I talking about here? Well, I'm talking about things like Confucian values, very unusual relationship, unique relationship in many ways between the state and society. Very unusual conception of the family. Social customs like guanxi, ancestral worship, an ideographic language, Chinese food, chopsticks. I mean, all these things are not a function of the last 100 years. Now, here you have an absolutely basic difference between China and Western countries. Western countries are constituted on the basis, fundamentally or predominantly, varies from country to country, but always predominantly on the basis of national identity, on the basis of nation state. China is different. China is first and foremost constituted on the basis of civilization. It has absolutely far-reaching implications. You cannot understand the Chinese state without a concept of Chinese civilization and the civilization state. You cannot understand the Chinese attitude towards race, which in many ways is very different from what predominates in the West, without understanding this notion of Chinese civilization. I mean, the whole evolution of the Han as a concept, as a construct, as a race, and so on. So this is absolutely point of departure for understanding China. I'm going to give you one very, very quick example of this, because I could go on. It's such a fascinating subject with what seems to me enormous implications. But Westerners don't really get it. Well, I did a talk in India. In fact, I did a series of talks in India. And for India, it's very different from China, but they got it. They got it in a way that the Westerners don't get it. because we have no experience of this. But India has, and many other countries in the developing world have some sense of what one's talking about here. Now, remember 1997, handover of Hong Kong from Britain to China? And you may remember the Chinese offer was one country, two systems. And I don't think any of us really understood what the hell the Chinese were on, us being in the West, understood what the Chinese were really on about when they were making this proposal and what it would mean. I think we probably thought, well, when China gets its hands on Hong Kong, it'll just be like the rest of the People's Republic of China. It's just window dressing until they get their hands on it. Well, we were so darn wrong, weren't we? Because today, Hong Kong is as different from the rest of the PRC as it was in 1997. They meant it. They meant it. Why did we get it wrong? We got it wrong because we have a nation-state logic. What's a nation-state logic? One nation, one system. German unification after 1989. What happened? East Germany disappeared. Reconstituted on the basis of West Germany, the new Germany. It was a perfectly logical way of doing it for Germany because Germany is a nation state, but China is not a nation state. China is primarily a civilization state. It is impossible to run a country of this extraordinary size and diversity on the basis of rule from Beijing and everything is the same. It's a this is a continent. This has got 1.3 billion people. That province there, those four provinces together have a population larger than that of the United States. Those 9 provinces there each have a population larger than that of Britain or France. It is vast. It varies enormously, not just economically, but also politically, culturally, or in many different ways. The only way that China could run is on the basis of actually one civilization, several systems. So this has got enormous importance. Okay, I'll stop talking about civilization state now. But it's such an interesting subject, I'd like to carry on. The second example I want to take is about the family. Now we think, often people in the West think, the process of the growth of individualism in society is a generic global trend, and every country will go in the same direction and become, in a sense, like we have done. And it is certainly true, that young Chinese, there's all sorts of, whatever I say about history, one's always got to remember that China is changing at the speed of light. And the gap between generations is enormous because they've been shaped by and conditioned by and generated by such different circumstances. But having said that, there are also extraordinary lines of continuity. And a key continuity is undoubtedly, notwithstanding the one-child policy and things like that, is the sheer importance of the family, one of the 2 great institutions in Chinese society. The family is nodal, pivotal in Chinese society in a way that it just isn't in the West, in any society anymore. How is it? Well, there's lots of illustrations I could give you. The Chinese always write symbolically they write their name. The family name always comes before the given name. The family name is what matters, not the given name. Marriage is a union of families, not simply a union of 2 individuals. Chinese parenting, you may be familiar with this, but Chinese parenting is really significantly different from Western parenting. There's a very good book by Howard Gardner, the Harvard educationist, on this. I think he must have adopted a Chinese kid or something because he spent quite a bit of time in China. And he draws the very strong differences. Chinese parenting is much more prescriptive. It's based on a much stronger notion of what is right and what is wrong, and the authority of the parent is much greater than it is in Western societies. Or the position of the elders, the seniors in Chinese society. By law as well as by custom, it is the responsibility of parents to look after and keep the elders of the family, the seniors of the family. And also, by the way, and this is not confined by any means to China, but it's common in East Asia, it is a shame shame-based culture, not a guilt-based culture. Western culture is a guilt-based culture. We need to save, we have to, Jesus Christ, was born on earth to save us from our sins. That is not the way in Chinese society, or in Japanese society, or Vietnamese society it works. It is based on shame, a question of losing face, and so on. And you are socialized via the processes within the family. The Chinese essentially have a much more optimistic, and always have had much more optimistic view of human nature than Westerners. They don't think we're inherently sinful. They think if you're brought up in the right way by your family and by the educational process, there's no reason why you can't be a good person. So that's my second point about Chinese society. This is a fundamental difference, and whatever the enormous changes taking place, this will be in various ways, changing ways, mutating ways. It will remain, it seems to me, fundamental feature of Chinese society. Thirdly, China as a great power. Now, I suppose the assumption is, what will it be like? And the assumption, I suspect, that most of us have, well, somewhere or other, it will be like the United States. That it will exercise the same kind of the power in the same ways as the United States in a situation of global hegemony. I don't think that's right. I don't think that's right. I don't mean they won't have anything in common, of course they will. But I don't think that's right. And I don't think it's right for the following reason. It is true that European and American society, Western societies, share with China a notion of universalism. They think that they both share, both aspects share, the idea that in some way or other they are a model for the world. But the way in which they interpreted historically being a model for the world was profoundly different. For Westerners, for Europeans, because we start with Europeans here, the Europeans interpreted universalism as a desire to expand across the world, to conquer territory, and to civilize the uncivilized, to project and convert their religion, Christianity. I mean, this was what the colonial empires that accounted for such a large percentage of the world from the late 19th century until the middle of the 20th century were about. Now, China's notion of universalism was very different. China's notion of universalism was the land under heaven, the Middle Kingdom, the most advanced civilization in the world. So why would you want to leave the land under heaven? Why would you want to step out? Chinese have a very strong sense of superiority. Why would you want to step outside heaven, the land under heaven, into darkening shades of barbarianism? So actually, China's notion of universalism was essentially a stay-at-home universalism. So, whereas we worship those, go to any British city and you'll find those who led colonial conquests and so on, their statues littered around the major cities. In China, that never happened. If you stepped outside and migrated, for example, to Southeast Asia, you were stepping outside civilization. You were not deserving the protection of the emperor. Very, very different historical tradition. So the Chinese had no empire. They didn't colonize. Well, the nearest they got to, you could argue that under the Qing dynasty, when they conquered these in the 17th century, that this was a form of colonial expansion. But it was on their own continent, and they never sought to colonize, for example, Southeast Asia and Indochina, which they could have done. Instead, they had something different. They had the tributary system. Which I won't go into now, but it did not involve conquest of these territories. So this seems to me a fundamental difference between the experience of the Chinese and the experience of the West. The other difference is this. China's huge. China's got a massive population. Today, 1.3 billion people. It's a population 4 times the size of the United States. larger than the United States and Europe put together. It's a very difficult country to run. The problem facing all rulers of China in the imperial period and in the communist period is how the hell do you hold it together? Because when you've got a country that large, with that big a population, the centrifugal forces are very, very powerful. And from time to time, of course, they've upset the Chinese apple cart, and they've gone through periods of very difficult conflict. So, the priority of all rulers in China, and I envisage this to be true in the future, now and in the future, will always be, first and foremost, domestic rule. Avoiding chaos. You know, the emphasis on stability and order in China is for a good reason. It's an extremely difficult country to govern. I mean, governing a little island like Britain, in comparison, is a doddle. Governing China is extraordinarily difficult. This is why, in many ways, the Chinese state, and I'll come to this in a moment, is so hugely competent. So, that's my second point, that China will be a different kind of third point, a very different kind of global power. My fourth point is about the state. Now, we think in the West, we get the Chinese state absolutely wrong, in my view. Absolutely wrong. We think that the Chinese state is the Achilles heel of China. You know, why? Well, because it's not democratic. So it's got no legitimacy. We think that the legitimacy of the state is purely and simply a function of democracy. But if you look at these kind of figures, for example, from Tony Sachs' work, he's at the Kennedy School at Harvard, on levels of satisfaction, and they're borne out by the Pew Global Attitudes figures as well. For levels of satisfaction amongst the Chinese with their government, they're extraordinarily high. I mean, the left-hand column, the blue one, is central government, and you see credibility, legitimacy goes down the more and more local you become. But they are extraordinarily high figures, and the Pew figures are the same. Now, how do you explain this, given that China is not in our terms democratic? Well, I would suggest three ways of thinking about it. First of all, for the Chinese, the state has a very different meaning and a different relationship to society to the one we have in the West. For the Chinese, they see the state as the embodiment of what the country is. They see the state as the representative guardian of Chinese civilization. It goes back to the question of the civilization state. It's the protector of the unity. If you want to know why Mao, to this day, enjoys such prestige amongst the Chinese, much greater than Deng Xiaoping's ever achieved, even though he was the architect of the economic transformation, it was because Mao did something extraordinarily precious in the eyes of the Chinese. He put the country together again in 1949. He reconstituted the state as the central institution of Chinese society. And even though he screwed up left, right and centre in all sorts of ways, subsequently, for the Chinese, this made him, if you like, one of the great emperors. Now, the second reason that I think the consideration to understand the Chinese state and its relationship to society is that in Western society, we see the state in essentially utilitarian and instrumental terms. What would it do for me? If you think it's going to work, you vote for X. If you don't think they're going to do a good job, you vote for Y, or whatever it is. Now, the Chinese don't really see the state in those terms at all. They see the state in familial terms. They see, Confucius, writing 2,500 years ago, suggested that the model for the emperor was the father. The emperor should act like the father it's obviously a patriarchal society. The model for the role of the emperor was the father in the family. And the Chinese view the state in familial terms. Now, this is so alien to our way of thinking, so profoundly different. But actually, it's not just true in China. In some degree, it's true in Japan, and it's also true in Vietnam, and it's true in Korea, in Confucian societies. Well, the last point, because I want to say it, but I haven't really got time to go into it, is I just want to say something about race, because no one ever talks about race, and it's so important, and it's very important to understand that you can never understand any society in the world unless you understand the process of its ethnic construction. And China is no exception to this. You know, you all know that China's huge, 1.3 billion people, but I bet you didn't know that over 90% of the Chinese think of themselves as one race, the Han. It's extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. It's completely different from the next four most populous countries in the world, India, the United States, Brazil, and Indonesia. They are completely different. They all regard themselves to be multiracial, multicultural. But China doesn't really accept at the edges. Why? Because, well, how did the Han develop? How did this notion of the Han develop? How did this construction of the Han well, over a very, very, very long historical period. This is why the civilization state notion is so important to understanding the ethnic construction of modern China. If you want me to elaborate, I'll deal with it in questions. Okay. So I just want to, what I'm trying to convey here, I hope with some success, is that China ain't like us. I don't mean there's nothing in common, I don't mean we're not part of humanity, but its historical development is so different. And you've got to remember, you know, that we're very recent compared with China. I mean, China is the longest continuously existing polity in the world. Going back, well, arguably, it's one of the first, you know, one of the first settled with the Fertile Crescent, the first settled agriculture in the world. So China has a very, very long history, and maybe instead of people being surprised about China's rise now, this is the wrong way of looking at it. What we should be surprised about, maybe, is not the period since 1978, but what the hell went wrong between 1800 and 1949. Because for the most of the rest of the thousands of years of Chinese history, it was arguably one of, and often the most advanced country in the world. So you could say it is a return to what China is, and Chinese think of it like this in many ways. We are returning to where we have always been.